In the spring of 1944, German officers analyzing intelligence reports about American infantry capabilities noted something that seemed to confirm their assumptions about American military culture. American forces, they observed, had adopted a semi-automatic rifle, the M1 Garand, as their standard infantry weapon. Every American infantryman, from privates to sergeants, carried this 8-shot semi-automatic rifle. German officers reviewing this information discussed what it meant for combat effectiveness. The consensus among German military leadership was that the American choice of a semi-automatic rifle over a traditional bolt-action rifle represented American preference for technology and firepower over disciplined marksmanship. German military doctrine, refined through decades of professional military tradition, emphasized that infantry combat was won through carefully aimed fire from well-trained soldiers. The bolt-action rifle, specifically the Karabiner 98K that German infantry carried, embodied this philosophy. It required the soldier to aim carefully, fire, manually work the bolt to eject the spent cartridge, and chamber a new round, then aim and fire again. This process, German doctrine taught, created disciplined soldiers who made every shot count. The German assessment of the M1 Garand reflected deeper assumptions about American and German approaches to warfare. German military culture valued precision, discipline, and the well-trained soldier, who was essentially a craftsman of violence. German infantry training emphasized marksmanship, with soldiers spending extensive time on rifle ranges, learning to shoot accurately at various distances. The bolt-action rifle was seen as the proper tool for this kind of warfare, a weapon that rewarded skill and punished carelessness. The semi-automatic rifle, by contrast, seemed to German military theorists like a weapon for soldiers who lacked the discipline for aimed fire, who would rely on volume of fire rather than accuracy. It suggested that Americans, coming from a society focused on mass production and technological solutions, were applying industrial thinking to infantry combat. Rather than training better soldiers, Americans were giving adequate soldiers a weapon that let them fire rapidly without requiring the same level of skill. To German officers, this seemed typically American, substituting technology for training, quantity for quality. What German officers analyzing American equipment didn't fully appreciate was that the M1 Garand represented a genuine revolution in infantry weapons. The rifle had been designed by Jean Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer who had immigrated to the United States as a child and who had spent decades working on firearms design. Garand understood that infantry combat was changing, that the static trench warfare of World War I was giving way to more mobile operations where rapid fire would matter more than the deliberate aimed fire that characterized earlier conflicts. He designed a rifle that could fire as rapidly as the soldier could pull the trigger, 8 rounds before reloading, using a gas-operated mechanism that was reliable and relatively simple. The M1 Garand had been adopted by the US Army in 1936, and by the time America entered World War II, production had ramped up to equip the entire infantry force with this weapon. American soldiers received the same marksmanship training that all infantry received, learning to shoot accurately at various ranges, but they also learned to use their rifles' rapid-fire capability effectively. The Karabiner 98K that German infantry carried was an excellent weapon by the standards of bolt-action rifles. It was accurate, reliable, and well-made, embodying German engineering quality. German soldiers trained extensively with the Kar 98K and became proficient in its use. A skilled German infantryman could fire his rifle, work the bolt, and fire again in just a few seconds. The Kar 98K held 5 rounds in an internal magazine that was loaded using stripper clips, and an experienced soldier could reload fairly quickly. By the standards of bolt-action rifles, the Kar 98K was as good as any infantry weapon in the world. The problem was that it was a bolt-action rifle competing against semi-automatic rifles, and the fundamental mechanics of how the weapons operated created an insurmountable disadvantage for the bolt-action user in close-range combat. The mathematics of fire rate told the story clearly. A trained soldier with a Kar 98K bolt-action rifle could fire approximately 15 aimed rounds per minute under combat conditions. This required firing, working the bolt, reacquiring the target, and firing again, repeated continuously. It was physically demanding and required the soldier to break his cheek weld on the rifle stock each time he worked the bolt, then re-establish proper shooting position before firing again. A trained soldier with an M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute under similar conditions. The semi-automatic action meant the soldier maintained his shooting position, pulled the trigger for each shot, and the rifle automatically ejected the spent cartridge and chambered a new round. The Garand shooter could focus entirely on aiming and trigger control without the physical and mental task of working a bolt action. In practical terms, this meant an American rifleman could put 3 to 4 rounds downrange in the time it took a German rifleman to fire once and reload. In a firefight where both sides were trying to suppress the enemy while maneuvering for advantage, this difference in fire rate was enormous. German infantrymen first encountering American forces equipped with M1 Garands in North Africa and Italy in 1943 began reporting back observations that challenged the assumptions German officers had made. After-action reports from company and battalion commanders noted that American rifle fire in combat was far more intense than expected. German soldiers described being overwhelmed by the volume of fire coming from American positions, fire that seemed continuous rather than the deliberate aimed shots German doctrine anticipated. Some German reports speculated that Americans must be equipped with large numbers of automatic weapons, because the rate of fire seemed too high for standard rifles. When it became clear that the fire was coming from American semi-automatic rifles, German frontline officers began expressing concern that their bolt-action armed infantry were at a serious disadvantage in close-range engagements. The first major test of American infantry against German forces in Europe came with the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. The hedgerow country of Normandy created fighting conditions where infantry combat occurred at close range, often just dozens of yards between opposing forces. The hedgerows, ancient earthen berms topped with thick vegetation that divided Norman farmland into small fields, created a battlefield where visibility was limited and where small unit firefights determined who controlled each field. This was exactly the kind of combat where the M1 Garand's advantages would be most apparent. American infantry squads moving through hedgerow country would encounter German positions at close range, and firefights would erupt suddenly, with both sides trying to gain fire superiority quickly. In these engagements, the American ability to deliver rapid fire proved decisive again and again. A typical hedgerow firefight illustrated the M1 Garand's advantages clearly. An American infantry squad of 12 men, all armed with M1 Garands plus 1 or 2 Browning automatic rifles for additional firepower, would approach a hedgerow. German forces on the other side, perhaps a similar-sized group armed with Kar 98K rifles and maybe an MG-42 machine gun, would open fire when the Americans came into view. In the first few seconds of the engagement, before anyone had taken cover or established firing positions, both sides would be firing as rapidly as possible. The American squad could collectively put nearly 100 rounds into the German position in those first critical seconds. The German squad, limited by bolt-action rifles, might fire 30 to 40 rounds in the same period. This 3-to-1 advantage in initial firepower often determined the engagement's outcome before it really began. The Germans would be forced to take cover under heavy fire, disrupting their ability to aim and shoot effectively, while Americans could maintain fire superiority and maneuver for advantage. German soldiers writing letters home or keeping diaries during the Normandy campaign frequently mentioned American rifle fire as a significant concern. One German infantryman's diary, captured after his death and later translated, included an entry from July 1944 describing a firefight in the hedgerows. He wrote that American fire was so rapid and continuous that it seemed impossible that each American soldier was firing individual shots. He speculated that Americans must have some new type of automatic rifle that he hadn't heard about. Only later did he learn that the Americans were using semi-automatic rifles, and he wrote that German soldiers with bolt-action rifles could not compete in close combat against such weapons. The diary entry concluded with the soldier writing that he had been trained to believe German infantry were the best in the world, but the American rifle gave Americans an advantage that German training couldn't overcome. The sound of the M1 Garand in combat became something German soldiers learned to recognize and fear. The rifle produced a distinctive sharp crack when fired, different from the heavier report of the Kar 98K. But more distinctive and more memorable was the metallic ping sound that occurred when the 8-round en-bloc clip was automatically ejected after the last round was fired. This ping became one of the most recognizable sounds of American infantry combat. German soldiers learned that the ping sound meant an American soldier nearby had just emptied his rifle and was reloading. Some German infantry, when they heard that distinctive sound, would attempt to rush the American position during the reload, hoping to catch the soldier vulnerable with an empty rifle. This tactic occasionally worked in isolated situations, but it was far more dangerous than German soldiers anticipated because American infantry operated as units, not as isolated individuals. American infantry doctrine emphasized that soldiers in a squad should never all reload simultaneously. In a firefight, some soldiers would be shooting while others reloaded, ensuring continuous fire on the enemy position. When one soldier's Garand pinged and ejected its clip, other Americans nearby were still firing, providing cover while their squadmate reloaded. Reloading the M1 Garand was also much faster than reloading a bolt-action rifle. The en-bloc clip system meant a soldier could reload in just 2 to 3 seconds by inserting a fresh 8-round clip into the top of the rifle. The rifle's action would automatically chamber the first round, and the soldier was ready to fire again. German soldiers with Kar 98K rifles, by contrast, needed 5 to 7 seconds to reload using stripper clips, and during that time they were completely unable to return fire. The tactical situation was that German soldiers trying to exploit the Garand's reload sound often found themselves rushing toward American positions that were still putting out heavy fire, and they were doing so while carrying rifles that would leave them vulnerable during their own longer reload process. The mythology that developed after the war about the M1 Garand's ping sound being a fatal flaw was largely exaggerated. Some claimed that American soldiers in combat would purposefully throw empty clips against rocks or metal to create the ping sound, trying to trick Germans into thinking rifles were empty when they weren't. There's little documentary evidence that this was common practice, and interviews with World War II veterans generally don't support the idea that the ping sound was a significant tactical liability. The reality was that in the chaos of combat, with explosions, gunfire, and other noise, the relatively quiet ping of an ejecting clip was difficult to hear at any distance. More importantly, by the time Germans heard a ping and decided to exploit it, they were moving toward American positions that maintained fire from other squad members, making the rush suicidal rather than advantageous. The German military's attempts to field their own semi-automatic rifles revealed how far behind they were in this aspect of infantry weapons development. The Germans had experimented with semi-automatic rifles before the war, but these designs had not been adopted for general issue due to manufacturing complexity and cost. When German forces began encountering the M1 Garand in combat and reporting its effectiveness, German ordnance authorities accelerated development of semi-automatic rifles. The Gewehr 41, introduced in 1941, was Germany's first semi-automatic rifle issued to troops, but it was heavy, unreliable, and difficult to manufacture. Only small numbers were produced. The improved Gewehr 43, introduced in 1943, was better but still problematic and expensive to manufacture. Total production of the G43 throughout the war was approximately 400,000 rifles, compared to over 6 million M1 Garands produced by the United States. By the time Germany had a workable semi-automatic rifle design, the war was already being lost, and German industry lacked the resources and time to equip their infantry with semi-automatic rifles in meaningful numbers. The production disparity between American and German semi-automatic rifles reflected broader differences in industrial capacity and manufacturing philosophy. American industry, with its emphasis on mass production and standardization, was ideally suited to producing complex weapons like the M1 Garand in enormous quantities. The rifle was designed from the start with mass production in mind. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Manufacturing processes were developed that allowed semi-skilled workers to produce components using machine tools. Assembly was broken down into steps that could be performed efficiently on production lines. The result was that American factories could produce M1 Garands quickly, in large quantities, and at reasonable cost. By 1944, multiple American manufacturers were producing Garands, with Springfield Armory and Winchester being the largest producers. The rifles coming off these production lines were consistently good quality, reliable, and functionally identical regardless of which factory produced them. German weapons manufacturing, by contrast, still retained elements of traditional craftsmanship that made mass production more difficult. German weapons were often superbly made, with tight tolerances and excellent finishing, but this precision came at the cost of production speed and volume. German firearms factories employed skilled workers who had trained as gunsmiths, and German weapons designs often included features that reflected engineering excellence but complicated manufacturing. The Kar-98K could be produced in fairly large numbers because it was a relatively simple bolt-action design that German industry had been manufacturing for decades. But when Germany tried to produce semi-automatic rifles, the complexity of the designs combined with the precision German engineering demanded meant production was slow and expensive. Germany never solved the problem of how to mass-produce semi-automatic rifles the way America had, and this failure meant German infantry remained at a disadvantage throughout the war. Individual American soldiers who carried the M1 Garand developed deep appreciation for the weapon based on their combat experience. Veterans of the European theater, interviewed decades after the war, consistently praised the Garand for its reliability, accuracy, and especially for its rapid-fire capability. One veteran of the Battle of the Bulge described using his Garand during German attacks, being able to fire 8 rounds at charging German infantry before needing to reload, and feeling confident that his weapon gave him a fighting chance even when outnumbered. Another veteran who fought through France and into Germany recalled that American soldiers trusted their Garands completely, that the rifle almost never malfunctioned even in terrible conditions, and that knowing he could fire rapidly gave him confidence in combat. These weren't abstract assessments about technical specifications, but testimony from men who had depended on the weapon in situations where their lives were at stake. General George Patton's famous quote that the M1 Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised reflected the views of many American military leaders who understood what the weapon meant for infantry combat effectiveness. Patton, who commanded the Third Army through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, had extensive experience observing American infantry in combat. His assessment that the Garand was the greatest battle implement wasn't hyperbole, but professional judgment from a commander who understood that infantry combat was ultimately about individual soldiers with rifles engaging enemy soldiers, and that giving American soldiers a weapon that let them fire 3 or 4 times as rapidly as their opponents was providing a decisive advantage. Patton's endorsement of the Garand carried weight because he was known for demanding excellence and for being willing to criticize equipment or tactics that didn't meet his standards. When Patton praised something, people listened. The M1 Garand's impact extended beyond just the firepower advantage it provided. The weapon's reliability meant American soldiers could trust it to function when needed. Unlike some complex weapons that required careful maintenance and could malfunction under adverse conditions, the Garand was robust and forgiving. It could be fired after being submerged in water, dropped in mud, or exposed to sand and still function reliably after basic cleaning. American soldiers landing on Normandy beaches, wading through surf with their rifles, found that their Garands would fire even though they had been soaked with salt water. This reliability was a result of the weapon's design, which used a simple gas-operated system with relatively few moving parts, and of the quality manufacturing that ensured parts fit properly and could withstand hard use. German weapons were generally reliable as well, but the Kar-98K's bolt-action mechanism was inherently simpler than a semi-automatic action. So the fact that the Garand matched bolt-action reliability while providing semi-automatic capability was an engineering achievement. The N-block clip system that the M1 Garand used was both the source of the weapon's famous ping sound and a loading system that proved very effective in combat. The 8-round clip was inserted into the rifle from the top, pushing down against spring pressure until it locked into place. The rifle's bolt would automatically close and chamber the first round, readying the weapon to fire. When the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected with the distinctive ping sound, and the bolt locked back, indicating to the shooter that the rifle was empty. Reloading simply required inserting a fresh clip. This system was faster than loading individual rounds or using stripper clips to fill an internal magazine, as was required with the Kar-98K. American soldiers carried their ammunition in cloth bandoliers, each holding 48 rounds in 6 8-round clips. Accessing a fresh clip and reloading took just seconds, and experienced soldiers could reload by feel without taking their eyes off the target area. The training American soldiers received on the M1 Garand emphasized both marksmanship and rapid fire. Basic training included extensive range time, where soldiers learned to fire accurately at various distances, from close range out to several hundred yards. But training also emphasized speed, teaching soldiers to fire rapidly at multiple targets, to reload quickly, and to maintain fire on enemy positions while maneuvering. This training reflected American tactical doctrine that emphasized fire and maneuver, where infantry squads would suppress enemy positions with heavy fire, while part of the squad moved to advantageous positions. The M1 Garand was ideal for this style of fighting because soldiers could lay down suppressive fire, firing multiple rounds at enemy positions to force them to take cover, while other squad members moved. German infantry, limited by the slower fire rate of bolt-action rifles, found it more difficult to provide effective suppressive fire, making their own maneuver more dangerous. Pacific theater combat against Japanese forces provided additional validation of the M1 Garand's effectiveness, particularly in the kind of close-range, intense combat that characterized island fighting. Japanese infantry tactics often included massed banzai charges, where large numbers of soldiers would attack American positions hoping to overwhelm them through shock and numbers. These charges were suicidal against the firepower American forces could deliver, and the M1 Garand was a major reason why. Marines defending against banzai charges could fire 8 rounds as rapidly as they could pull the trigger, reload in seconds, and continue firing. The volume of fire that a Marine rifle company could deliver with M1 Garands was devastating to attacking Japanese forces. Marines who survived banzai charge attacks consistently credited their Garands with saving their lives, noting that bolt-action rifles would have allowed far more Japanese soldiers to reach American lines before being stopped. The story of Jean Cantius, the rifle's designer, added a distinctly American dimension to the weapon's legacy. Garand was born in Quebec, Canada, in 1888 and immigrated to the United States with his family as a child. He had little formal education, but was mechanically talented and taught himself engineering and firearms design while working in textile mills and machine shops. He began working for the Springfield Armory in 1919 and spent the next 15 years developing the rifle that would bear his name. Garand never became wealthy from his invention because as a government employee, his patents belonged to the US government. He received recognition of tumult and respect within military ordnance circles, but lived modestly and continued working for the army until his retirement. His story was the American immigrant success story, someone who came to America with nothing, worked hard, developed his talents, and contributed something of lasting value to his adopted country. The fact that an immigrant designed the rifle that American soldiers carried to victory in World War II seemed fitting to many Americans who saw their country as a place where anyone, regardless of birth, could achieve great things through ability and effort. Post-war assessments of infantry weapons consistently rated the M1 Garand as the finest general-purpose infantry rifle of World War II. Military historians analyzing what made American infantry effective cited the Garand as a major factor, giving American soldiers a capability that no other nation's standard infantry weapon could match. Soviet forces used semi-automatic rifles in limited numbers, but never equipped their entire infantry with them. British and other Allied forces used bolt-action rifles throughout the war, though British soldiers who fought alongside Americans often expressed admiration for the Garand and wished they had similar weapons. German generals and officers, interviewed after the war about what had impressed or surprised them about American forces, frequently mentioned American infantry firepower and specifically the M1 Garand as something they had underestimated. The weapon that German officers had dismissed as an American gimmick before experiencing it in combat was recognized after the war as having been a genuine tactical advantage that affected the outcome of countless infantry engagements. The M1 Garand remained in American military service through the Korean War and into the early 1960s, when it was finally replaced by the M14 rifle, which was essentially an updated Garand with a detachable magazine and capability for full automatic fire. Even after being replaced as a frontline weapon, Garands remained in use for ceremonies, training, and other purposes. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, a government-sponsored organization that promotes firearms training and marksmanship, has sold surplus M1 Garands to qualified American citizens for decades, allowing civilians to own and shoot the same rifles that American soldiers carried in World War II. These surplus Garands are highly valued by collectors and shooting enthusiasts, not just as historical artifacts, but as functional rifles that are still enjoyable and practical to shoot 75 years after they were manufactured. For Americans of the World War II generation, now in their late 90s or already past, the M1 Garand was more than just a rifle. It was the weapon they had trained with, carried through combat, depended on for their survival, and used to accomplish the mission of defeating fascism. The solid weight of the rifle, the distinctive sound it made when firing, the ping of the ejecting clip, the smooth action of the gas-operated mechanism, all of these sensory memories stayed with veterans for their entire lives. When veterans gathered at reunions or visited museums where Garands were displayed, many would ask to hold the rifles, feeling the familiar weight and balance, remembering being young and scared and far from home, but knowing that the rifle in their hands worked, that it gave them a fighting chance, that it was reliable when everything else was chaos. That emotional connection between soldier and weapon reflected the reality that the M1 Garand had been a trusted companion in the worst experiences of these men's lives, and that trust had been earned through the rifle's consistent performance when lives depended on it. The German generals and officers who had dismissed the M1 Garand as an American gimmick before experiencing it in combat learned through painful experience that their assumptions had been completely wrong. The semi-automatic rifle wasn't a substitute for training or a technological crutch for inferior soldiers. It was a genuine advancement in infantry weapons that gave American soldiers a significant tactical advantage in firefights. The mathematics were simple and undeniable. American riflemen could fire 8 rounds in the time German riflemen fired 2. That 4-to-1 advantage in firepower meant American infantry could dominate firefights, could suppress enemy positions more effectively, could maneuver more safely while their squad provided covering fire. German tactical doctrine, German training, German military tradition. None of it could overcome the simple reality that in a close-range firefight, the side that could fire more rounds more quickly had a decisive advantage. The M1 Garand gave American infantry that advantage in every engagement, and it helped win the war at the level where wars are ultimately decided. Individual soldiers fighting other individual soldiers. The German officers who had analyzed American equipment and concluded that the semi-automatic rifle was a gimmick had made a fundamental error, mistaking American innovation for American desperation, and that error contributed to German defeat in countless infantry battles across Europe. The greatest battle implement ever devised, as General Patton called it, had proven itself against the best infantry the Germans could field. And American soldiers who carried the Garand knew they had the finest infantry rifle in the world.